Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. It is Thursday, the 9th of April, 2026, a year later than I thought. Interesting piece in the New Yorker this week on Sam Altman. He may control our future, but can he be trusted? And the image of Sam is of many faces of Sam. And of course, this question of trust and the future in Silicon Valley is one that we often pursue on this show. In comparison with Sam Altman, another of the major players in our AI game is Demis Hassabis, the head of AI at Google, perhaps the adult in the room. And whatever one thinks of Demis, I think it would be hard to argue that he carries as many faces in his pocket as Sam Altman. My guest today has a new book out about not Sam Altman, but Demis Hassabis. Sebastian Mallaby is one of Britain's most distinguished journalists, worked for many years for The Economist, written many books on venture capital, and now has this major biography of Demis Hassabis. He's talking to us from a hotel in downtown New York. Sebastian, congratulations on the new book. Would it be fair to say that it would be hard to imagine Demis carrying lots of faces around in his pocket, a la Sam Altman?
I think Sam Altman is sort of almost uniquely duplicitous. I mean, Silicon Valley has quite a lot of fake it till you make it. But Sam Altman really does seem to have managed to annoy everybody he's worked with by saying one thing and then doing the opposite. Demis Hassabis, on the other hand, has had a much more stable career path. He founded DeepMind back in 2010, sold it to Google in 2014, and he stayed there running DeepMind continuously for 16 years. Whereas, Sam has jumped around a bit and considered things like running for governor of California. So I think, certainly Demis is more consistent. He's motivated by something a bit different. He doesn't just want power. He wants scientific enlightenment. And I say enlightenment advisedly. It really is a sort of a spiritual quest for him. And so, I think they are different.
You've written, as I said, a number of books, mostly on money, venture capital. You seem to have wrestled, morally at least, with this decision to write this book. It took you, 3 years? You had to get Demis's permission. What were the moral questions for you personally, Sebastian, that you wrestled with in terms of writing this biography of Demis?
Well, I kind of came in with the idea that creating really powerful AI was sort of the 21st century version of the Manhattan Project, that, this was dangerous stuff, that the AI inventors of today have their hands on the modern version of the nuclear material. And, in some ways, it's an amazing scientific feat to bring this into the world. At the same time, could be dangerous. And I wanted to portray a thoughtful person wrestling with a reality that he could be doing something really bad. And what did it feel like? I mean, it's sort of, how do you sleep? How do you explain your motivations to the world and to yourself? And so those were some of the kind of wrestling that went on. It was less about me than about the subject I was grappling with.
So there's a bit of the Oppenheimer about Demis, do you think? This guy who perhaps didn't sleep very well. Or was that more in your mind? I mean, I know in the movie The Thinking Game, which of course isn't Oppenheimer, it's a documentary in comparison to Oppenheimer, which was fiction and was major Hollywood fiction. Demis is portrayed as a very down-to-earth kind of character, very ordinary, perhaps not just surprisingly ordinary, but in a weird way, disappointingly ordinary.
Yeah, he's a funny mixture because he's ordinary seeming in the way he holds himself, the way he delivers his message. He might be up on the stage and the tone of the delivery is sort of hey, what about if we wash the dishes, after lunch? This kind of boyish figure in a round neck shirt and sneakers, and it's not like Elon Musk where you can't count the number of children. This is a guy who married his Cambridge girlfriend and has 2 kids, and lives in the same house continuously, and it's just a very different vibe. But what is not normal, and what is not at all disappointing, is that in this kind of guy next door package, you get an outright genius. I mean, he can riff on everything from neuroscience to computer science to the history of movies to philosophy to business theory and how you build companies. I mean, he can do it all, and the range of his thinking. As I sat there in a pub in North London talking to him for hours and hours and hours, was like unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I mean, I've talked.
Which pub was it? Where did you sit? And where does he live?
So he lives in North London.
Whereabouts? I mean, I don't want the street, but what neighbourhood?
Highgate. He lives in Highgate in North London. And
not the fanciest neighbourhood.
Not the fanciest neighbourhood. I mean, I think he has a nice house, but not a kind of, for somebody who presumably must be worth, 500 million or something. Given the way that Google's stock price has performed and Demis's position in Google, having sold his company to Google, he's got plenty of cash, but he's not spending it, as you can sort of infer from where he lives and how he lives. I once said to him, so okay, how do you spend your money? Do you have a second home? He said, no, I don't want that. Well, what kind of car do you drive? Can't remember what it's called, but it's more than 10 years old. My wife has it. Well, do you have any hobbies that cost a lot of money? Well, I did buy season tickets to Liverpool. How much does that cost? Well, I think it was sort of £2,500. I mean, there isn't a lot of, taste for luxury in the package. So this is the ordinary side, but the less ordinary thing is just this intellectual range. And so we would meet in this pub, as I was saying. It's near his house in Highgate. There was a dusty staircase at the back of the pub, which people didn't know about. So if we went up there to the upstairs room, there'd be nobody disturbing us, sit there for 2 hours. Cumulatively, it was more than 30 hours of discussions. And, he would just, to give you an example, and going back slightly to Oppenheimer, I asked him one day what it felt like to set up DeepMind, raise the money from Peter Thiel. It's 2010, Demis. You've got your first office. It's in Russell Square in London. What did that feel like? And I know from experience that when you ask people to reconstruct the emotion of something that happened 15 years before, the answer you normally get is, yeah, it was cool. I mean, people don't recall the feeling very well. But Demis is so articulate and vivid that he would say, yeah, so we were in this attic office in Russell Square. It was kind of hot because the sun was beating down, and it wasn't very well insulated. But now and again, I get a breather, and so I would go down the stairs. Of course, no lift. It was a very old building. So ding, 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 ding. I go down the stairs, and outside in front of me, there is the greenery of Russell Square. So that's nice. But what's really good is on the right, 3 doors down, there was the London Mathematical Society, where Turing, the father of British computer science, he gave his lectures there. And so now we're completing his mission by building AI. And beyond that, you know what there is, Sebastian? There is a level crossing. And the pedestrians cross the street. It goes black, white, black, white, black, white. And as somebody in the 1930s, do you know who it was? It was the Hungarian nuclear scientist, Szilard. He was crossing that level crossing. He had the idea for a nuclear chain reaction, which led to the Manhattan Project, Sebastian. And it's perfect because we're doing the modern version of the Manhattan Project. So his storytelling is off the charts.
Yeah, maybe you should write a novel. The Guardian review was a little, I'm sure you've read it, Sebastian, probably annoyed you.
It did,
but
yeah.
It does focus on this, and it suggests that he's not as interesting as you think. I mean, I don't know how the Guardian guy knows, because I don't suppose he spent hours in a Highgate pub with Demis. But how would you respond to that kind of criticism? I mean, obviously, the zeitgeist these days is of hostility towards major technologists like Demis. What's your thoughts on this dismissal of Demis as a major intellect? I mean, obviously, he's very smart on the technology front.
Yeah, look, I think you said it yourself. I think people just are very, very skeptical of technology leaders. And, if you look at that New Yorker profile of Sam Altman, you can see why they are skeptical of technology leaders, right? It's not a crazy position to take. My point is twofold. There can be differences between individuals. Just because some guy in Silicon Valley may be a sociopath, it doesn't mean that his competitor in London is the same. No, they're different. They're very different. Formation is different. One has a Nobel Prize and the other one dropped out of Stanford. One is a deep scientist. The other one isn't a scientist at all. It's just, you can go on. I mean, it's so different that I think tarring Demis Hassabis with the prejudices one absorbs by reading about Elon Musk or Sam Altman and applying those to Demis Hassabis would just be totally wrong. And so I didn't do that. I learned a lot about him because I spoke to 100 people in his entourage, people who knew him when he was at Cambridge, people who knew him when he was building his first company. I talked to people who had fallen out with him, like Mustafa Suleyman, the co-founder of DeepMind. I really did a 360. And at the end of the 360, at the end of more than 30 hours with him and all these hours with other people, I can tell you he's a sincerely good person. And I know this from. So what am I supposed to do? Am I going to say, well, he's just a tech leader, though he's a bad guy? I'm not going to do that. And the serious other reason why I shouldn't do that is that, look, there are two categories of stuff that goes wrong in the world, right? There's one category where you have some idiot in control who makes a bad decision because they're either an idiot or they're just evil. And, the Iran war is a very good example of an idiot making a stupid decision to go to war, right? And so if you had switched out the person who happened to be the president, you wouldn't have had the Iran war, and we would be in much better shape. Then there's a second category of screw up, which is much, much more interesting, where you have a good person who is smart and trying to do their best, and yet ineluctable larger forces lead them into a position where things go wrong. And that is the story with Demis Hassabis, that he is trying to make AI safe, but larger forces having to do with the race between China and the US and multiple labs competing against each other makes it very hard to deliver safety. And so, the problem with the Guardian kind of position is not merely that it's wrong about Demis, but also that it obscures a much bigger structural thing that we should all be worried about, that this is larger than individuals. The reason why AI is going wrong right now is larger than individuals. It's about race dynamics and the failure of governments to intervene to prevent those race dynamics from causing a lot of danger.
The other thing the Guardian picked up on was in the book you said, for every Donald Trump supporter in the tech industry, there's also a Bill Gates. I mean, I assume you wrote that before the whole Epstein thing broke. Are you 100% confident that there's no backstory to Hassabis, that there are no scandals hanging around that may come out later?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm pretty confident. I, as I say, spoke to people who knew him on the chess circuit when he was a kid, people who knew him at Cambridge, people who said to me honestly that working with Demis was too much for them. He's too intense. And, one guy had a nervous breakdown, had to go spend a year recuperating. And then, there are people like Mustafa Suleyman who worked with him and got kicked out and had plenty of negative things to say about him.
Well, what is the Mustafa Suleyman story? We had him on the show. He wrote a book a year or two ago, which was kind of critical of technology. It was a bit of a, I won't say a Me Too book because that brings the wrong connotations, but a book that wasn't particularly original. I know that Suleyman got thrown out of Google when Hassabis and Suleyman came over. Now he runs AI at Microsoft. These always seem to me, as an outsider, these guys are a million times better than I do. A couple of North London lads founding a tech company. Why did they fall out? And is Suleyman the evil face of, or maybe the real world face of Demis?
They had, it's a very interesting story. They had backgrounds in North London, both of them. Suleiman is 8 years younger than Demis, but he did go to the same school that Demis attended for a bit, a kind of good government school, but it was competitive entry, kind of grammar school.
And you, of course, Sebastian, went to Eton, which is anything but a government school.
Totally different. Yeah, that's right. So these people, I admire them because they had a lot more adversity in their background than I did. So they both rise up from modest circumstances, but Suleiman's is notably tougher than Demis's, right? I mean, Mustafa Suleiman's father was an immigrant from Syria who drove a cab, struggled with English, was sort of semi-literate. There was no books in the home, no music. You go to the mosque every Friday. It was devout, strict, and not enlightened. And then his parents split up when Suleiman was 15, and they leave. One of them goes with a new partner to New Zealand, and then the dad, who's from Syria, goes back to Syria, leaving Mustafa at 15 to look after himself and his younger brother, who's 14, and survive in London. Right? This is a seriously wild story. And, you know, despite that adversity, Mustafa, who's extremely smart, gets into Oxford. He hates Oxford because he feels out of sort, because it's just culturally alien to him. So he drops out to found a thing called the Muslim Youth Helpline to prevent suicide amongst young Muslims in a time of Islamophobia on the back of the Iraq War. This is extraordinary background for somebody to then be a co-founder of a tech company. So, I mean, Demis is amazing, and you know, Demis is the scientist of the two, and Mustafa is on a different level in terms of his path and his sort of scientific foundation and training. But don't underestimate Mustafa's smartness and his drive and his determination.
Now, did Demis have anything to do with Mustafa getting fired at Google?
It's a good question. I mean, Demis would and did argue to me at huge length that he didn't do it. It wasn't him. And, you know, basically there was a inquiry into alleged bullying by Mustafa Suleiman, and the legal counsel took care of this, and it ended up in him leaving. This is nonsense, as I said to Demis. And nothing happened at DeepMind without Demis being okay with it, because, you know, he was by far the dominant founder of the three founders, by far. And he ran the whole thing. And if Mustafa was kicked out, it was because Demis was okay with him being kicked out. And so, yeah, I would say he fired him, and Demis would protest. And I did hear that protest, and I kind of ignored it. So the reason they parted ways is partly just this is a classic founder story. You know, you work intensively together for 10 years or 9 years. And in the end, there's a difference of emphasis and where you want to go. And I think Mustafa had kind of grown a lot through the DeepMind experience and wanted to basically run something himself. And Demis was the boss of DeepMind, so there wasn't space for two people trying to run it. And they clashed increasingly. And in the end, you know, Mustafa's very hard-charging style led to bullying allegations. And that was kind of the pretext or the trigger to push him out. And Demis was kind of okay with that because he was sick of fighting with his co-founder, and he was happy to move on.
Do you bring much of your own personal baggage to this? You're very much part of the British elite. Your father was Sir Christopher Mallaby, the British ambassador to Germany, who went to the top British school, Eton, then you got a first at Oxford. Demis came up a very different way. His parents were, I mean, in the way it's presented, and maybe you present it slightly differently, the way it's presented in the thinking game, Demis's parents are kind of alternative hippie style people who didn't really fit in any way. They're very unusual characters, but certainly his parents weren't British ambassadors to Germany, didn't go to Eton. What did you learn from the Hassabis story about yourself? Did you have some revelations about British class system and all that sort of thing?
You know, look, I am who I am, and I don't think it I mean, it's easy for me to say this, but I don't feel like, it's influencing how I judge people like Demis, who came up a totally different way. I mean, if anything, it would make me more impressed, right? Because I'm aware of my own privilege, and I'm, I think, properly, I acknowledge and celebrate people who do incredibly well despite not having the advantages of going to a private school. So I'm not sure what else to say about that. I mean, there are other things that I think talking to Demis made me think about, right? Which, one would be, for example, here you have this person who wants to make AI safe. He's not managing to make AI safe because it's a race dynamic and it's kind of above him, it's bigger than him. He can't prevent other labs from being unsafe with AI. So he's sort of stuck. And so it makes me think about, why does he go on? And I came to the view that, look, you could just condemn him and say you should stop. But then if he stopped and he took a professorship at Princeton, it wouldn't make the world safer. Google would carry on building AI. All these other labs would carry on building AI. It would just remove from the scene one actor who would like ultimately to try and make it safe and use it for science and for medicine and good stuff. So I'm not sure it helps the world if he takes a kind of morally purist position and says, I'm out of here, I'm not going to build it because it's not safe. Furthermore, I think you could argue that, he sees a technology, he wants to develop it. It's both exciting and it's frightening. And he takes that trade and he moves on with it. Isn't that kind of like all of human history, that we as humans have always confronted new technologies? They've always been both exciting and disruptive. We've taken that trade, we've moved on, we've gone forward with them. And this is like what it means to be human. We are not just, I think, therefore I am. We're also like, I invent, therefore I am. And so I think there's something, maybe Demis is sort of an enlarged version of all of us. So I had those kinds of thoughts confronting Demis. If you want to, push me and ask more specifically where the class thing matters, happy to talk about it.
I had Geoffrey Hinton on the show a few months ago. Another Nobel Prize winner, another genius, maybe not quite in the Demis class, a slightly more mercurial character perhaps. But I was really struck, you talk about making AI safe, I was really struck by Hinton's intellectual naivety. He said to me that the way to make AI safe was to program it so it thinks like a woman, which to me, not all women are ideal. We all lived through Mrs. Thatcher in England and blah, blah, blah. Does Demis bring, I take your point that he's incredibly smart and that he knows all about nuclear science and he can walk around Russell Square and point to crossings and streets where one kind of scientific invention was made or discussed. But does he have a sophisticated moral antenna? Has he read philosophy?
Yeah. He has read philosophy. He will talk to you about Spinoza. He will talk to you about Kant. He will talk to you about, I guess those actually are the two that came up the most. But he's pretty much of a polymath. I read a book called Range once, pointing out that a lot of people who do great stuff do it because they, in their formative years, tried out a lot of different things. And so it's not actually true that to be a great violinist, you should only play the violin. You should play other instruments too. If you want to be a great sports person, trying several different sports is a good idea. And Demis is the ultimate magpie. He's tried lots of things. First degree in computer science, graduate degree in neuroscience. He did something different. Played chess to an almost professional level, then kind of quit and learned Go and a bunch of other games. He's just spanned a lot of things. And that's why he's so interesting to me, because he's got this range of intellectual curiosity. And I think trying to say, oh, no, he doesn't have a formed and sophisticated view of philosophy, or for that matter, almost anything, would be to underestimate him. He really,
I certainly wouldn't suggest that. I mean, I haven't met the guy, although I hear about him a lot because my wife is senior executive at Google, so I hear all the stories about him. So he's more of a fox than a hedgehog in Berlin's terms. You mentioned that he talks about Spinoza, or he talked to you about Spinoza and Kant, two very ethical philosophers, or at least philosophers of ethics. How did he turn Kant or Spinoza into today's questions or dilemmas over AI? How did he present his deep reading of philosophy in terms of the dilemmas that he, as the head of AI at Google, has today?
Well, Spinoza came into the conversation because Spinoza had this formulation that, I mean, as I did a bit of reading about Spinoza to try and get on Demis's wavelength. And as I recall, the interesting thing about this moment in the 17th century was that, you know, he was trained both in classical Greek philosophy, which was sort of non-Christian, and at the same time in Christian thought. And he wasn't a conventional Christian, and in fact, the Christian church condemned him. But he had a spiritual language because of that side of his training. And he talked about getting closer to God through scientific inquiry. If you understood the way nature works, the way science works, the way physics works, that creation that you're understanding better is God's creation, and you're getting closer to God by understanding his creation. That was kind of the God that Spinoza describes in his writing. And for Demis, this God of Spinoza is also his religion. I mean, he said to me that for him, scientific inquiry is precisely getting closer to understanding the fabric of reality, and this reality seems to be designed in a way that makes sense, and so there must be some sort of intelligent design behind it, or at least there might be.
Yeah, so you wrote in the book, doing science, or he said, doing science is like reading the mind of God.
Yeah, and this comes from Spinoza, and it comes also via Einstein and other scientists who invoked the God of Spinoza. And the funny thing is that I think once Demis started talking about it, some other tech people, notably Elon Musk, have said that they believe in the God of Spinoza. So it's kind of passed around amongst these tech bros. But I think Demis came to it before Elon. Yeah, I mean, so that's an example of how philosophy figured.
So, but some people might say, if doing science is like, as Demis said, doing science is like reading the mind of God, maybe science is a kind of warning. I mean, did he bring up counter-enlightenment thinkers, people who questioned that faith in science? I mean, there's a great tradition of that in Western thought too, and non-Western thought.
He didn't bring that up, but I know that he would occasionally say, the problem with such and such is that, it's a challenge to the Enlightenment. And I think he shudders at that because the scientific method is something that he identifies closely with Enlightenment thinking, the kind of faith in reason, the faith in accumulating knowledge. We all build on the shoulders of previous intellectual giants. And that's how humans make progress. I mean, that kind of vision, which is an Enlightenment vision, is sort of, I think, also his vision. And he sees himself as building AI to do better science. It's kind of the modern version of the telescope. In the past, scientists built new tools, microscopes, telescopes, etc., to understand the fabric of reality better. And now his way of building on that is a machine cognition.
You mentioned Demis could be teaching at Princeton rather than working at Google. Of course, Einstein worked at Princeton. Many other great physicists too, I think, including Oppenheimer at some point. Maybe I'm wrong on that.
Yeah, you're right.
Why? I mean, if the way you're presenting him as this highly moral, highly intellectually sophisticated figure who cares about the future of the world and sees in science the mind of God, why is he a senior executive at Google? Why not just take that job at Princeton? He could choose his own job, his own title. He could probably choose to create his own university, call it AI University or Demis Hassabis College. Why is he spending his time with other senior executives at a $3 or $4 trillion company based in Silicon Valley. Why waste his time on that front?
Yeah, I don't think he would agree that he's wasting his time. I mean,
But I don't mean wasting his. I mean, he's obviously not wasting his time. But it's just one company. I mean, there's OpenAI, there's Microsoft, there's Anthropic. I mean, he's not controlling the whole future of AI.
No, he's not. But he is one of the people who is a leading architect of the future of AI, and possibly the most important one, because probably OpenAI will go bust because its valuation is insane.
Yeah, you wrote an interesting piece back in January for the New York Times, an op-ed. This is what convinced me OpenAI will run out of money. So you're definitely very bullish on, very bearish on OpenAI. But sorry, go on.
Yeah. So, and I mean, look, I think Sam Altman, as I said before, not a scientist, a very good fundraiser, but so good at fundraising that he's overdone it and pushed the valuation of OpenAI up too much. And they need to radically focus the company and cut their cost and their burn rate if they're going to survive. I think it's 50-50 if they can pull that off. But anyway, I think it's safe to say that Demis has more influence on the future of AI than anybody at OpenAI. Not least because there is no single person at OpenAI who is both a scientist and a leader. So that's one comparison. Dario is closer to being like Demis than Sam Altman is.
Dario Amodei, of course, the CEO of Anthropic, has got a lot more press these days because he's been willing to take on the DoD.
Yeah, exactly. And he is a proper scientist, and he's the founder of a company, and he's building serious artificial intelligence, a very good model, particularly the one that came out in January, which is agentic. So he is definitely an important player. Whether he's more important than Demis, I sort of doubt, because I think if you look at the full range of innovations that's come out of Demis's shop, particularly on the science side with AlphaFold, which was the system that won the Nobel Prize, I would say that Demis is more important than Dario. But anyway, we could debate that. But I mean, so he's not the only AI leader. I'd say he's the most important AI leader. And see, this notion that he's at some mega company wasting his time is not really fair. He's building.
I didn't say that.
Okay.
It's exactly what I didn't say.
Okay.
My question was, and I didn't say waste his time. I mean, you say he doesn't really care about money. The only thing he spends money on are his Liverpool season tickets, which are probably very cheap these days. Why work at a large corporation when he could set up his own nonprofit, when he could create his own department at Princeton, or Harvard, or Oxford, or wherever he chose?
Right. So the answer is, look, he did fantasize to me several times about, the delights of retiring to Princeton and going to the Institute of Advanced Studies, which is where all of those intellectual heroes of his spent time, from Oppenheimer to Einstein to Kurt Gödel and others. So that definitely is appealing to him. And, he doesn't dismiss that as a possibility at one point. But for now, to do what he's trying to do, build super powerful intelligence, he needs a ton of money. He needs enormous amounts of computing power and all the energy infrastructure that's needed to power those data centers. You can't do that. Even if you are a famous Nobel Prize winner, you're not going to get foundations at an academic institution to back you to the tune of $100 billion a year, which is the current research budget at Google. So to do large-scale, cutting-edge AI, you need to be in a corporation. And the proof of this is partly OpenAI, where they started that as a nonprofit, and they had to give that up because as a nonprofit, you couldn't raise the cash to build frontier systems.
You, in the book, you spend quite a lot of time in the Infinity Machine. You talk a little bit about the initial ethical battles Demis and Mustafa had with Google about the terms of acquisition and their role within the company. Perhaps talk a little bit about that. I mean, is one of Demis's ambitions to transform Google, to make it reflect his own values? After all, Google is a very controversial company on lots of fronts. They they initially started with the claim that they weren't going to do any evil. Most people would disagree with that these days. Is he a moral crusader in your view within Google? Is that his history there?
No, he's not a moral crusader. And let me explain a bit about that. I think he combines good values with pragmatism, and he believes in picking his shots. So he's not going to do a Dario, which is to take a principled position and tell the Pentagon, you can't use my technology either for domestic mass surveillance nor for autonomous lethal weapons, which is what Dario Amodei did about a month ago. And the reason Demis isn't going to do that is because he thinks if he does that, it won't make a difference to the outcome. And in fact, it hasn't made a difference to what the Pentagon does. What Demis does do is figure out where the door is a bit ajar and where you can push and actually get it open. So an example would be, after ChatGPT came out, politicians were suddenly waking up to AI and worried about safety. He suggested to Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister at the time, why don't you do a global AI safety summit, invite everybody, including the Chinese, and we'll do this at Bletchley, and we can start a conversation going about how to make this technology good for humanity. And Sunak did that. And then there was a follow-on conference in Korea, South Korea. And so, that was a little bit of progress. And then the UK set up the UK AI Security Institute, and the scientists from DeepMind went over to that institute to be the chief scientist working for the government on AI safety, and he did it with Demis's blessing. So, I mean, there are things where Demis sees an opportunity to actually make a difference, and I think he pushes on those. What he doesn't do, and people can have legitimate debate about whether he should do more of this, he doesn't make a stand for the sake of making a stand.
Right, like Dario. I mean, you mentioned that he well-read in Spinoza and Kant. It sounds to me, in the way he behaves, maybe in contrast to the way he thinks or believes, that he's been reading Hobbes. He's a realist.
Fair point.
I mean, there's not a lot of Kant and Spinoza in that kind of behavior, is there?
No, you're right. But yes, I take the point. I mean, Kant figures in his thinking in a totally different way, which is to do with...
But isn't that, in all seriousness, Sebastian, perhaps, I'm not suggesting that Demis has many faces like Sam Altman, very few people do, but is he able to compartmentalize technology and morality to suit himself, to make himself comfortable, to enable the remarkable life he's having? It must be very exciting managing AI at Google.
Yeah, look, you're doing an intellectually stimulating job of pushing on these points where he may just be self-interested.
I'm not suggesting he's self-interested or evil. I mean, there's a middle ground between being a saint and a sinner, isn't there?
Okay, great. Now we're talking the same language. I completely agree with that. And I think that there are lots of things where he has a position that's convenient. And, they're kind of, you can debate whether they are true. Like, for example, he says that building Gemini involves no taking away of focus from other bits of his mission, such as AI for science. Now, he is pursuing AI for science in parallel. The AlphaFold 2 system has now been replaced by AlphaFold 4. So the drug discovery agenda is advancing. But surely building Gemini takes up a massive amount of resources and time and compute and energy and his psychic focus and all that. And so there must be some displacement of progress in other fields. And he also would argue, well, it's okay because if you look at the way that large language models have developed since 2022, they've made a lot of progress which is useful for all fields of AI. It's not just chatbots that we're building here. We're actually advancing the science, which is generalizable. And I think that probably is true, actually, because there's been reasoning models and multimodal and all these different innovations which are probably helpful for other types of AI that one might want to build in the future. But I think this is the interesting debate. This like, you know, everybody is somewhere in the middle between a saint and a sinner. I think
Except
that
Elon Musk, of course.
I
And
think
probably
that
Peter Thiel, who considers himself the Antichrist.
but I think dealing in caricatures of these powerful people is always tempting, but not really true.
Well,
People are more
I take
complicated
your
than that.
point. He was in the news recently. He's always in the news about possible Pentagon AI deals within Google. Did you do a lot of digging in Google? I mean, what's his reputation there amongst his staff and amongst other senior people? Is he the irritating moralist who always brings up good and evil in senior meetings, or is he the realist who gets stuff done?
So there was a period between 2016 and 2019 when he conducted a secret fight with Mountain View. But people leaked me documents, so I knew a lot about it. And the point of the fight was that he wanted there to be a sort of safety oversight board governing the deployment of artificial intelligence, so that it wasn't just the Google corporate board. So his position was, this technology is too powerful for just Larry and Sergey to be deciding what happens. So we need a board with somebody like Barack Obama or some other independent, reputable person who will be a counterweight. And Google kind of pretended to be open to that, but wasn't really going to cross the line. So there was this long fight involving big teams of lawyers. People leaked me documents, which were the term sheets describing a DeepMind independence spin-out sort of structure, and it'd be covered with red lines where the other side's lawyers had suggested, you know, different language. So this was a very involved thing, and I think it, you know, at that time, the people in Mountain View, at least at the top of the company, who were on the other side of the negotiation, viewed Demis as, you know, a very difficult character to handle. He was pushing on safety and making a big fuss about it, and they wanted. So I mean, Sundar and David Drummond,
the CEO, of course.
Yeah, and David Drummond, who was the sort of chief legal officer
at the time, no longer there. He got thrown out too for bad behavior, I think.
True. And so they had a long fight. And Demis was quite annoyed with me when I said I was going to write about this, and I had to endure, you know, pressure from the DeepMind General Counsel. But since he didn't have a leg to stand on, I published it anyway. But yeah, that's the best example of where he was viewed as an irritant.
I'm sure you're familiar with Parmi Olsen's book, Supremacy, AI, Chat, GPT, and the Race That Would Change the World. It won the FT Book of the Year, I think the year before last. Parmi's been on the show lots of times. Mm-hmm. She argues that Demis will end up as CEO of Google. And she hasn't written your deep psychological analysis. I mean, I'm not sure how much time she spent with Demis, but when I used Gemini, Google's AI, when I asked Gemini about senior Google executives, it was interesting. Demis was about 8th on the list, even after Neil Mohan, the CEO of YouTube, and Kent Walker, who took over from David Drummond. Kent Walker's my wife's boss. Is he ambitious, do you think? I mean, is he seen as ambitious to want to run Google? Sundar has done a great job, really. A lot of people thought he wasn't going to last. The Google stock today is up to about 320. At some point, he's going to quit and go and spend the money, buy his own island. There are other very senior people who are influential. Philip Schindler, the SVP of business, the guy who runs the cloud, Thomas Kurian, TK, is also very powerful. Do you think that, is your sense that sometimes when Demis can't go to sleep, he wonders whether he's going to be CEO of Google? He plans, he plots.
You know, I think this is a very interesting question, because it goes to the dichotomy in his personality between, you know, the guy who would like actually to go to Princeton and be a professor and think big thoughts and have that freedom to think, versus the sort of super competitive person who grew up as a chess player and simply loves to win. And so I think, one part of him can't resist capitalist competition, and being CEO of Google would be tough to turn down. But the other part of him would genuinely prefer not to do it and would rather do science, would rather at least be in the current position. He claims that he still has time, because he works until 4 a.m. every day, to spend sort of between midnight and 4 reading scientific papers and thinking about science. And, he, to his sort of emotional health and functioning, I think he feels that's quite important. And he's worried that if he was the CEO of the whole thing, he couldn't do that. So I think he is genuinely torn. If I had to bet, I would say he does not want to be chief executive of Google. But as I say, there is also this massively competitive side. So
yeah, one wonders whether, I mean, when I asked Gemini about Google priorities, the thing that came up first is an AI focus. One would guess, I mean, he must be on pretty good terms with Sundar, but one would guess that he wouldn't be particularly comfortable if somebody like Philip Schindler or TK or Neil Mohan took over Google with their very commercial instincts. So he might be dragged, if you like, morally to become CEO, because in his moral mind, at least, or his semi-moral mind, he's a better alternative to any of the other sales guys.
Maybe. I mean, I think what's certainly true is that the relationship with Sundar Pichai is very strong, and they have this sort of buddy act where Sundar is managing the high politics of Google and delivering enormous resources so that Demis can do this extremely expensive research, and he's giving Demis the space to develop the AI as he would like to develop it. And Demis needs Sundar Pichai as his patron, and Sundar Pichai needs Demis as his scientific kind of icebreaker. And that buddy act is possibly the single most important buddy act in global business.
And that buddy act, I assume, also exists in Demis's head. I mean, there's a little bit of Sundar in him.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the realist versus the idealist, the guy who wants to read scientific papers until 4 a.m, in contrast to running a company of several 100,000 people worth several $1 trillion.
Sure.
Answering to a board, having a stock price, dealing with the reality of sales, having to deal with cloud sales and lawsuits and all the rest of it.
During these negotiations I described between DeepMind and Google, when Demis wanted to spin the company out or get a safety board, he kept on the latest legal draft of a potential independent DeepMind structure. And these things are, fat, dense legal documents. And he would groan and say, "Why are you showing me this? I don't want this part of my brain to grow." And so I think that's an insight into his appetite for being CEO.
And finally, Sebastian, as we enter this AI age where we're supposed to have smart machines, you mentioned Turing earlier. Of course, there's the Turing Prize for mimicking AI. What does your story about Demis in the Infinity Machine tell us about what it means to be human? Often people come on this show and say, "Oh, AI is going to destroy humanity," or the human, whatever that means. I'm always wary of the H word. You haven't used it so far. But does Demis Hassabis himself, independent of Google and AI, does he offer a lesson, a slideshow, shall we say, in what it means to be human as a model?
I think, well, first thing to say is that he has a model of superabundance, some point in the future, maybe 10 years from now, when the AI really has bedded in and it's generated enormous progress in science and productivity gains in the economy and all that. And, we have abundance as a result. And in this environment, maybe companies don't really matter anymore, because if you think about an economy where supply is massively increased by AI, the abundance means that prices fall. And what is money, and you sort of
Demis that's the Musk line as well. Although I'm sure most of the people at Google wouldn't be thrilled if they were no longer companies.
Right. But Demis is quite happy to riff on this superabundant future, and he says it derives partly from the science fiction he read when he was young. There's a series by Ian Banks called the Culture Series, which describes a future where there are lots of intelligent machines going about, doing their business, having their own political intrigues, not bothering humans, living in parallel to humans. And humans, can kind of travel to different planets because there are amazing rockets, and you can sample different ways of living on different planets. And, to Demis, this is a cornucopia of opportunity. And if you have abundant curiosity, then superabundance may be a wonderful thing. Now, Demis is not a normal person in the range of his thinking and the sort of privilege that his intelligence buys him. And so for many people, this may be an entirely different prospect. So I think I'm telling you what he thinks. I'm not necessarily endorsing it because I find it somewhat naive, that bit of it.
Right. So what you're saying, Sebastian Mallaby, author of The Infinity Machine, is that Demis's idea of abundance is wrong.
Yeah, certainly too simple. Yeah. I think to find, for me, the bit in the story where one confronts a future with AGI, super powerful intelligence, is among the Go players who were defeated by AlphaGo. Because this is super intelligence in one domain. You had suddenly a machine that could beat the best players in the world at Go. And so for these players who had spent their entire lives drawing on a human tradition that went back centuries of how you find patterns in Go, how you play the game, the deep beauty of the strategy and the tactics and the patterns and the aesthetics, there was a sense that all of this accumulated human understanding of the game had been devalued by an algorithm that could do it all better and discover even more patterns that humans hadn't thought of. And some players, professional Go players, reacted by saying, I quit. I no longer see any point playing this. My life has been rendered meaningless. Others said, well, this is actually beautiful because the machine has discovered new patterns that we didn't know about, and I can find more depth in this game that I'm curious about. I want to understand it, and the machine will be my tutor. And in fact, both in chess and in Go, all the top players these days train with a computer system that's better than them, that teaches them new strategies. And so I think that's two visions of how humans can react to incredibly strong machine cognition.
You didn't answer my question, Sebastian. I mean, the question was a simple one.
Okay, sorry.
Demis has a vision of abundance in the future where there's no companies, no money. It's a kind of Muskian utopianism. Do you believe that's realistic or not? Yes or no?
No.
Well, that's clear. Excellent conversation. Wonderful story of Demis Hassabis, DeepMind, and the quest for superintelligence, The Infinity Machine, by one of our best journalists. Thank you so much, Sebastian. Very interesting conversation. Much appreciated. We'll have to get you back on when Demis runs Google to see what he's going to do with the company.
Okay, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.